Welcome, everyone, to the National Conference of Bar Presidents 21st Century Lawyer Program called How Your Bar Can Promote the Rule of Law. I'm Robin Wolpert, National Conference of Bar Presidents President. I practice at Sapientia Law Group in Minneapolis. Beth, I'd like to start our slideshow. And let's go to slide 1. Sustaining and promoting America's constitutional democracy is the singular challenge of our time, and lawyers and bar leaders play a vital role in meeting this challenge. Let's go to the next slide. Political scientists and organizations measure how robust a democracy is in the United States and the world. And the World Justice Project measures people's perceptions and experiences of the rule of law in 142 countries and jurisdictions on an annual basis. Here are the 8 factors that form the basis of the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index: constraints on government powers, absence of corruption, open government, fundamental rights, regulatory enforcement, order and security, civil justice, and criminal justice. Next slide. Here are the results from the World Justice Project's Rule of Law results from 2023. And as we can see, the top 5 countries in terms of performance in the area of rule of law are Denmark, Norway, Finland, Sweden, and Germany. The United States, some may be surprised to know, is ranked 26. Next slide. In fact, the results of the World Justice Project's work indicates that the rule of law has declined globally and has declined in 78% of countries between 2016 and 2023. Over 6 billion people live in countries where the rule of law has declined last year. Next slide. The results in the United States are similarly cause for alarm. On the 8 factors that form the Rule of Law Index for the World Justice Project, here are the rankings of the United States on these factors. And remember, until recently, the United States had one of the highest ratings on the Rule of Law Index. Let's go to the next slide. This slide indicates from the World Justice Project the United States decline over time since 2016. Let's go to the next slide. Now, social scientists have long studied the factors that impact the erosion of, or how robust the rule of law is in a country across the globe. And here are the factors that have been identified by political scientists: factionalism and identity-based politics, the perceived loss of status, the failure of protest, which means usually protest is used to create change, but when that fails, extra constitutional means are often used. Another factor is the loss of civil discourse, which impacts the legitimacy of democratic institutions, and this is particularly amplified by social media. The loss or erosion in trust and confidence in elections, and the use of tactics like constitutional brinkmanship, where things come to a crisis much more readily, rather than using norms of forbearance to dissipate and moderate political conflict. Next slide. Steve Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, in their path-breaking book, How Democracies Die, identify the key factor that they look at in terms of identifying whether a country's democracy or rule of law is eroding, and that's at the ballot box. The 4 indicators they say to look out for are rejection of or a weak commitment to the democratic rules of the game, the denial of the legitimacy of political opponents, toleration or encouragement of violence, and the readiness to curtail civil liberties of opponents, including the media. Next slide. So what can bars do? Next slide. At the National Conference of Bar Presidents for the past 2 years, what we've been doing is providing programming to bars on these very topics that are specifically targeted to the variables or factors that political scientists have identified as important in promoting the rule of law. And here's a list of the ideas and programs that NCBP has partnered with in terms with World Justice Project, with the ABA, with the Ohio State University, for example, so that our bars have ideas on what they can do to get into action. Civics education, for example, and the ABA Cornerstones Project, partnering with businesses who have robust civics education programs. Another idea is civility, how to promote civility, civil discourse, and lower the temperature of political or partisan-related topics. Other programs that bars can do, they can convene and bridge divides. They can educate members of the bar, members of the profession, members of the public, promote trust and confidence in elections. A lot of states, including mine in Minnesota, are partnering with their Secretary of State's offices in order to educate lawyers on the election process and then have those lawyers go out into their communities and speak to the legitimacy and the integrity of the process. People can volunteer and be poll workers, and in some states get CLE credit for that. We also have encouraged that bars to seek out and speak out on supporting the rule of law and seek out those opportunities to do so. And again, we've had programs around that issue of when and how to speak out effectively in support of the guardrails of democracy. And finally, we've encouraged and had programs regarding how to create task forces for bar associations to collect resources, convene lawyers and the public. Next slide. In fact, the ABA has established a task force on American democracy and a related advisory committee and your commission, and you're going to hear more about that. Next slide. And lawyers defending American democracy have also been engaged in work across the United States. And this slide and the next one speak to some of the work that LDAD has been doing in this space. Next slide. So before we begin our moderated discussion about what bars can do and how bars can get into action to promote the rule of law, what I'd like to do is introduce our preliminary remarks by Carlos Yunsan, who is from the University of Tennessee College of Law. And his preliminary remarks will give you an idea about what it's like to live in a country where the rule of law has eroded. So Carlos, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you, NCBP, for the opportunity to join you in this timely and important program. Good afternoon, friends and colleagues. It's a pleasure to be with you today. As Robin mentioned, my name is Carlos Yunsan. I'm a member of the faculty at the University of Tennessee College of Law. I'm the current president of the Knoxville Bar Association in Knoxville, Tennessee, but I'm a Panamanian by birth and an American by choice as of July 2016. But my American story began in Panama many, many years ago, particularly in the early to mid 1980s. That was a time when strongman Manuel Noriega started exercising full military dictatorship in Panama. And those are not pleasant memories. I was in my early 12, 13 years old of age at the time. I vividly remember the rubber bullets and the tear gas that were shot at us just for waving handkerchiefs or banging pots and pans on the sidewalks. I especially remember the disappearance and decapitation of a physician named Hugh Espadafora, someone whom my mother, also a physician, had met at the time, for simply daring to speak against the regime. And sure, we had puppet presidents at the time, but everyone knew, even a 12-year-old like myself, that power belonged to one person only. And those experiences have deeply shaped who I became as a person. I also believe they shape who I become as an attorney today. And this is why this program is important to me. Those experiences also inform my alarm as we now see our nation, the United States, having a growing preference for authoritarian forms of government, even autocracy. Some of the slides that Robin showed earlier, as you could easily Google and find a plethora of data, articles, both foreign and domestic, speaking about this new tendency. And you see, in 1989 Panama, the United States, for all its defects and faults, was viewed as a beacon of hope for democracy. Indeed, most of us welcome what you may know as Operation Just Cause. That was the military action that removed Noriega from power in December of 1989, just as the Berlin Wall was falling. This operation enabled Panama to rebuild a democratic process that it has enjoyed for the last 35 years. In fact, Panama just held last month its 7th contested election from that time. What is not being a contest is a transfer of power that is peaceful to a new administration. And that's our situation today, thanks to the efforts of the United States. So living here for the last 30 years, it's been somewhat unreal, but mostly confusing and somewhat disheartening to watch many in our country openly speak of scenarios where the rule of law is no longer viewed as desirable over a particular ideology. I think that's where we come in as lawyers. As lawyers, we're well equipped, and I believe have the responsibility to remind our communities of what makes our country strong. If we who interact with the legal system day in and day out do not speak out for the rule of law, who are our communities going to listen to? Well, they are listening likely to the social media experts or pundits, but we can honestly speak of the ways we fight to improve our legal system, which is not perfect, but also as to why the rule of law is important in our constitutional democracy, why it matters, unlike anything close to an authoritarian government can offer. So today, after you hear the panelists, I sincerely hope you consider how your bar association, even yourself as an individual lawyer, can do your part to hold up the rule of law at this crucial time. To end here, I'd like to quote retired U.S. Court of Appeals Judge Michael Luttig, who said recently, and I was lucky to be there, that this might be the most important effort ever undertaken by the legal profession. I so believe. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. So now what I'd like to do is invite our panelists to get on screen. We've got Lauren Rikleen, Executive Director of Lawyers Defending American Democracy. We have Betsy Andersen, the Executive Director of the World Justice Project. And we have Carl Smallwood of the Divided Communities Project of The Ohio State University. And I want to welcome all three of you. I'm thrilled to have you. The goal here is to talk about what bars can do to get into action to promote the rule of law. And so what I want to do is start off by saying this, that all of you are leaders in your organizations where you're doing precisely that kind of work. Why don't you each introduce yourselves to our audience and tell us a little bit about the work that your organization is doing. And why don't we begin with you, Betsy, then over to Lauren, and then Carl.
Great. Thanks so much, Robin, and welcome everyone. It's a privilege to join you for this really important discussion. So I lead the World Justice Project. As Robin mentioned, it's a multidisciplinary organization working to advance the rule of law globally. We do so by undertaking data collection and research, by stimulating stakeholder commitment and informing policymaking to strengthen the rule of law, particularly at the national and local level. We're best known for the WJP Rule of Law Index, which Robin mentioned in her introduction, which annually scores and ranks 142 countries and jurisdictions on those 8 different factors and 44 sub-factors that really allow you to get a fine-grained sense of how the rule of law is strong or weak in a particular jurisdiction. It's a helpful diagnostic and a benchmark for the never-ending work that we all have to do to strengthen the rule of law. As Robin mentioned, the U.S. ranks 26th in the index and has seen a marked decline in a number of factors in recent years. That caused WJP 2 years ago to launch our U.S. campaign called Building Trust, and it's focused on reversing those negative trends and promoting a rule of law resurgence in the United States. And I'll get into some of the ideas we have for doing so later.
Thanks, Betsy. Lauren?
Thank you so much. So Lawyers Defending American Democracy was formed as a nonpartisan, non-political organization to galvanize the legal profession into taking action to uphold the rule of law and protect democracy. And fundamental to our work is the belief that today's attacks on democracy, the rule of law, our election system are unprecedented and cannot be dismissed just as policy disagreements or fights between Republicans and Democrats. It's much deeper than that. And we work constantly to educate and engage our colleagues in the effort to protect the rule of law in a variety of ways. So we work to hold lawyers accountable to the oath that they took when they entered the profession, and to be accountable to their ethical obligations. In that role, we have filed a number of very carefully researched ethics complaints against lawyers involved in trying to overturn the 2020 election. We work on special projects. For example, you saw the slide that referred to our partnership with another organization to develop a model Supreme Court Code of Conduct. We've been developing a research tool that reveals how new state laws are moving those states into autocratic forms of government. That is actually happening now. And we invite you to look at that report, Marching Towards Autocracy, that's on our website, ldad.org. And it's a tool that we are continually updating and adding states so that we can see that the problem is not just at the federal level, but it's very much at state levels as well. We issue calls to action. We write opinion pieces. We, for example, have spoken out against the whitewashing of history that we are seeing. We've done a lot of communications asking Chief Justice Roberts to address the very real ethical crisis that is happening in the Supreme Court at this particular time. We try to be a resource to bar associations generally. And the last thing I'll mention is through our democracy commitment, we can talk more about that. We ask lawyers to pledge to use their status, their skills, their legal expertise, their convening authority to work with other governmental and civic leaders in a variety of projects. And we should get into that in a much more specific way as we engage today. And I'll just close by adding in our description that we are about to launch several efforts going forward, including a groundbreaking project involving college campuses. And so the plug is that we are always interested in lawyers who would like to volunteer their time to help us in the important work ahead, and hope this will spur volunteer activity as well. So I look forward to the rest of the discussion. Carl, it's now your turn.
Thank you, Lauren and Robin and Betsy. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be with you today. I'm Carl Smallwood. I'm the Executive Director of the Divided Community Project, which is housed at the Moritz College of Law on the Ohio State University campus. We're part of the program on dispute resolution there. We turn dispute resolution scholarship into practical advice and tools that communities can use to face division and to plan in advance of issues that divide their community along racial lines, religious lines, immigration status, political polarization, and other societal fractures. For example, as it relates to a religion, we have developed guidance for campus leaders who are facing tension on their divided campuses since October 7. And in about 90 minutes, we're going to be hosting 15 to 20 university presidents and leaders, senior administrators, to take a deeper dive into some of the data that's available, most recently related to that subject and the responses to the encampments, and to look to planning for the fall. With respect to democracy, the Divided Community Project last year convened a large bipartisan group of elected officials, scholars, law enforcement leaders, advocacy group leaders, subject matter experts like Steve Levitsky and others, to ask what we as citizens might do to assist with stemming the slide to autocracy. And the answer was that we should be speaking out to strengthen the guardrails of democracy. So the publication that we created looks a little bit like this. There'll be a link in your show notes here. And we've turned our attention to what lawyers can do in that regard and more. When we were introduced, I'm also the chair of the ABA's Advisory Commission to the Task Force on American Democracy. Lauren is the vice chair of that same body. That's a group of bipartisan, geographically dispersed ABA leaders, National Bar Association leaders. All parts of the ABA are represented, and there are 3 former ABA presidents who are part of that commission. We really look forward, I look forward to being part of this conversation with all of you. And so let's get started.
Well, thank you all. So let's just jump right in and ask the first hard question, which is, why should bars do something? I mean, of course, my introductory PowerPoint presentation just set it up as to why we should do something and care. But a lot of lawyers aren't used to being in action to defend democracy. They just assume it's working, they assume it's good, and they just are out there working for their clients and doing other things. So let me ask you this: why should lawyers get in action right now? Betsy?
Thanks, Robin. Well, I'd say 3 reasons. One, you've already mentioned, we are facing a crisis globally and in this country. And we've been tracking it at the WJP since 2016, where we've seen a majority of countries sliding toward autocracy and seeing declining rule of law scores. But it is accelerating and widening, and we need to reverse those trends. Second, it's a lawyer's ethical responsibility. Let me remind everyone of the preamble to the model rules of professional conduct, which say that a lawyer, as a member of the legal profession, is a representative of clients, of course, an officer of the legal system, and importantly, a public citizen having special responsibility for the quality of justice. So we've all signed up for that. The third reason is that lawyers and bar associations have particular skills and standing that I think are valuable in this work. And we can illustrate that when we get into some of the detail.
Okay, perfect. Lauren?
Betsy, as usual, just summed it up perfectly. And I think that what we have to be thinking about is how to grab the seriousness of this moment and turn it into action. I don't know at this point how anybody cannot be convinced about the level of crisis. The data exists. The rhetoric, the frightening rhetoric exists. The blueprints for how to eliminate rights are out there and are readable by any of us. And so I just think that we have to, as informed individuals, as lawyers, we have that obligation to raise the outcry on this. And just as in the at one point in the civil rights movement, President Kennedy asked the question, where are the lawyers? And he actually convened a couple of hundred of the most prominent lawyers in the country, including the president of the American Bar Association and others, to the White House to say, what are you doing? And here is an urgent matter that needs to be addressed, and we need the lawyers on board. And out of that came many initiatives that have subsequently turned out to be very, very critical. But the point is that it was a recognition of the seriousness of that moment that brought the lawyers together. And I would say that, we are there again, and we need to stand together as a profession.
Carl, one of the attendees asked the question of what it would take to galvanize people, because, again, we're so used to, we're involved with our clients. We might be involved in other matters, but to defend democracy seems like a singular challenge and something unusual that we're asking our lawyers to do. Carl, what does it take to galvanize people?
Yeah, I guess I was looking at the chat, and so maybe I'm answering the right question, maybe not. I'm not sure. The question I was looking at is why people don't understand why they should prefer democracy over autocracy, and maybe I'll try to tie all of it up. I mean, Lauren and Betsy have both said that lawyers are uniquely qualified to explain the importance of the rule of law. We're uniquely positioned to be heard and trusted on that subject, and we're uniquely responsible by virtue of our oath and our office to do so. with respect to you know, why people should prefer democracy over autocracy, it's a difference between rule of law and rule by law. And in some respects, you know, one of the things that I would urge each of you listening to do is to try and simplify in your own vocabulary and explanation what the rule of law is. I think the World Justice Project has done a superb job of taking a relatively complex subject and exploring it in depth. I find it sometimes hard to explain to people in a couple sentences what it is. And I think we each need to sort of reflect on that and sort of think whether, you know, even if it's a little bit shorthand, nobody's above the law. So leaders have to obey the law. Laws are equally enforced, publicly promulgated, and independently adjudicated. Now, I'm sure there's a little bit more to rule of law than that, but even with those few words, you can explain to people, and I hope people will understand, the difference between the law being what the leader says it is and not being accountable or answering to the law that the leader says is the law. And one that is in fact the rule of law as we understand it in this country. So I hope that understanding would galvanize people to understand that if there in fact is an autocrat in charge, their lives change dramatically in ways that Carlos was describing at the beginning of this meeting.
And I think Carlos's remarks really do highlight what it's like to live in an autocracy. But I will just go back to the founding era and emphasize that this form of government was created precisely because our founders believed that individual freedom and liberty were achieved through democracy, that my freedom and autonomy get to be decided because I participate in a democratic process, because I have freedoms. So in other words, it's not just about the process of making laws that matters, but it's the individual liberty and power that's achieved, potential that's achieved by participating in such a system. So let's go to the second question, which is kind of alluded to by a couple of comments in the chat, but I do want to ask this. Isn't this a partisan issue? In other words, why should lawyers and bar associations get involved if this is a political issue? Shouldn't this best be resolved in the political arena? Why should bar associations get involved? And Lauren, I want to start with you.
Sure. And I think that if we don't understand, you know, we have to understand how absolutely nonpartisan this issue actually is. Because if you lose your rule of law and you lose democracy, what do you have left? And we can disagree on policy. We can disagree on, you know, how to resolve climate or taxes or, you know, the economy, but we can't disagree on the fundamental point about the importance of having a functional rule of law. And would this be a good time, Robin, to just talk a little bit about Keller as part of?
Yeah, that would be perfect. And just for our audience, you know, some states or some of you may be involved in states that are mandatory bars, which means that the Keller decision from the United States Supreme Court may govern and place limits on the scope of your activities. Lauren, why don't you go ahead and talk about and answer the question, doesn't Keller stop my bar from doing anything?
Sure. So in addition to the question always about partisanship and trying to explain how this is fundamentally nonpartisan, the question always comes up about, well, bars can't do anything because of Keller. And it's almost as though this large, you know, curtain has gone up with the words Keller on it as a complete bar to doing anything. And so lawyers defending American democracy really dove into that issue, and we have posted on our website, and there'll be a link to it at ldad.org, a resource called State Bars Can Defend Democracy and the Rule of Law, consistent with Keller versus State Bar of California. And the basic premise of our analysis is that existing case law is not a prohibition against mandatory bars addressing the critical issues of democracy and the rule of law. We know that Keller and related case law establish that mandatory bars may speak out with respect to issues that are germane to their core functions. And case law clarifies that these terms have broad meanings. And what our article does is analyze all of these cases. And what we found is that there have been multiple lower court decisions interpreting Keller, finding that state bar activities defending the rule of law is in fact germane, and at least one has declared that defending democracy is a germane topic. The bottom line of our analysis is that programming that supports the rule of law and a fair and functioning legal system is fundamentally germane. And cases interpreting Keller have demonstrated an awareness that providing quality legal services is only possible in a system governed by a rule of law and understood by the public to be so governed. So when the rule of law is under attack in a way that creates distrust in how government and the courts function, then the legal system itself is in severe jeopardy. So what can be more germane than protecting that? The other thing I just want to mention that's important to note, that even if a bar engages in non-germane expressive activity, or somebody challenges that and claims it is, all Keller says is that there has to be a process for the bar members to challenge the activity and to get some kind of pro rata refund based on the percentage of that activity relative to their dues. So we really need to understand that this reliance on Keller as a prohibition against the engagement of mandatory bars just doesn't hold up under careful analysis.
Thank you. And Carl, Betsy, can you also speak to this issue of, is this a political issue and should bars get involved?
I guess I like Lauren, don't see it as a political issue. And in terms of the Keller analysis, I know Lauren has done deeper thinking about that than I have. On an organizational basis, though, I would urge the bars in the 30 or so states that are mandatory or unified bar associations to take a careful look at what they can and cannot do. I mean, ultimately, their charge is to protect the public. If we don't have a functioning legal system, it's impossible for us to protect the public. And so upholding the rule of law and protecting the rule of law shouldn't be a controversial issue. If further to that, I know we're here to talk about what bars can do, and we will do that. But as individual lawyers, all of the members in those bars are free to speak in support of the rule of law. And as a result, you know, there can't be a prohibition against them speaking, and unfortunately, it hasn't been a partisan issue to attack the rule of law. And unfortunately, we've seen you know, elected officials and others undermine confidence in the justice system, and as a result, it shouldn't be a partisan issue to counter those that information or those kinds of forces.
Thanks, Carl.
I would only add, Robin, that I think there's important work for bar leaders to do to avoid the politicization of the rule of law concept, and I would say that there are important strategies about how we do this work that can be helpful. One is to really try hard, as Carl's organization has done, to make these programs look and feel bipartisan, nonpartisan, have different views in the room when we're talking about the rule of law, and really build conversation across these divides. Second, I think it's really important for bar leaders to avoid and to speak out against those who characterize policy preferences as rule of law issues. And I've got a growing folder in my file cabinet of different policy issues where partisans on both sides of an issue, be it reproductive rights or immigration or environmental protection, characterize their position, both sides of the same issue, as the rule of law position. And I like to emphasize that actually the rule of law is agnostic as to particular policy outcomes. It really is about the system and the process. And that's really where we have to focus people's attention and reinforce allegiance to those institutions, processes, and norms, and really try and take it out of policy conversations.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Can I add, Robin, because I guess, in some respects, we may have focused, Lauren was focused a lot on the issue with mandatory bars. Obviously, there are a number of voluntary bars, and the local bars in the states that are mandatory, don't have the same constraints. And so, when we talk about what bars can do, Betsy's absolutely right in saying that in order for you to be able to reach those individuals who are receptive to these ideas, and to hopefully persuade those who may be undermining the rule of law, it's critically important to do so in a nonpartisan or cross-partisan or bipartisan or whatever the right term is way. And in fact, it amplifies the credibility of your message to present programs that have got people who are perceived by the public to be from different political parties or backgrounds or philosophies, both speaking in support of the rule of law. And that's something that we urge bar associations to do.
Bar associations, I think, have the most power when they act with neutrality. And that's been my experience in all the convenings that I've been involved in Minnesota, where we've tackled issues that have divided our communities. And when we bring people together and we do it, just as Carl said, with a diversity of viewpoints presented, but not dictating how people should think or feel or conclude about a various issue, you really do have that power. And then you give people the space to actually get educated and make really good decisions. So that is our power. Our superpower bars is our neutrality. Lauren, were you about to say something?
I completely agree. But I want to push the envelope a little bit on this part of the conversation, because I do think it is important. And particularly, we're involved in a project right now in which we're working very closely with some very brilliant college students who are constantly challenging us about their challenge as pro-democracy college students trying to engage their peers in understanding that they don't see democracy as something worth preserving necessarily or worth fighting for, because what they say to my brilliant interns is, well, I'm losing individual rights. I'm losing civil rights. So why should I care? What is democracy doing for me? And I do think we have an obligation as lawyers to help people understand that there is a fundamental link between democracy and the rights that we have come to know and believe in, throughout American history. So we have to walk that very fine line. And I'm a former bar president, so I well understand it. But we have to walk that very fine line between being able to speak the language of rights as humans, and the subtleties and distinction about arguing very specifically on policy, things that would be traditionally considered partisan. But we have to come up to that line, and we have to have some very open and honest dialogue about what that means, because it's there, and you can't just say, oh, civil rights, but we can't deal with that. That's too specific. Individual rights. It's all part of this conversation about what does democracy mean? What does progress mean? And how do we as lawyers help facilitate the conversations we need to have to make people still want to protect our democratic form of government?
Right, and just really linking everyone's civil rights and liberties to their everyday activities that they take for granted. The fact that they can read a newspaper, for example, or speak their mind, or have due process through the courts. So just all of those things, it's really, making the case. I guess the founders didn't have to make the case because they suffered under, British occupation and violations of their civil rights and liberties. So it was fresh in their minds. And that kind of propelled that whole experiment, I would say, in state and federal constitutional writing. But let's go back to the topic of what bars can do. So there are a variety of bars. We National Conference of Bar Presidents, our members are metro bars, state bars, affinity bars. There are people on this program right now, our attendees, who come from a variety of bars. Let's talk about the breadth of activity that individuals and bars can engage in, because you don't have, not every bar has to do the same thing. Different bars may choose to promote the rule of law in a different way. Carl, let's start with you. What are some of the ideas that you would have for bars that they could do? Maybe a big idea that would take a few years, and then some other smaller things that could be done right away.
Oh, wow. I guess this, whether it's big or small, get started. And you know, the low-hanging fruit may be in the work that you currently are doing and planning for the coming year. A lot of people have just become bar presidents in their jurisdictions. And so the years ahead. And there are going to be any number of things that are part of your calendar already. Your bench bar retreats and your section meetings and your law day activities next spring. So I guess that's a longer term kind of thing to plan. But each of those provides an opportunity for you to do some democracy related, rule of law related programming as part of your bar year without completely changing everything. I would urge you to collaborate across bars, that is to say, join with other bars, join with affinity bars, join with specialty bars in your community to broaden the conversation around these subjects. And I would urge as well that you consider doing some things that are public facing, speaking out, not simply speaking to lawyers, although that's very important, but speaking out to the public. So Kiwanis, Sertoma, Inns of Court, Federalist Society, American Constitution Society, you name it, get out there, have gun will travel. Bad analogy, and probably somewhat dated, but get yourself out there and begin to have the bar speaking to the community more broadly about ways they can get involved. Election, poll working, any number of things that might be helpful to those communities. So I hope that was partially responsive to what you asked.
Thank you, Carl. Betsy?
Sure. My bigger, longer term idea, well, first of all, I should say, I think every bar association should have a rule of law task force, a group of its leaders that are really focused on this and developing programming around this in an ongoing way. But I think the bigger, longer term challenge that I would focus people on is the challenge we have around accessibility and affordability and discrimination in our justice system. And these are problems that are centuries old in our country, but they continue to really challenge us in significant ways. So we share the WJP Rule of Law Index data. The US ranks 115th in its affordability and accessibility of the justice system, and 106th in discrimination out of 142 countries. So, this is pretty shocking and really highlights the work that needs to be done here. And it goes to some of the questions that people have had is how do we motivate people? And the fact that young people may not feel like this is a system worth fighting for, and it's not delivering for them. And it goes beyond young people. It's a broad challenge in our society. And I think that bars need to grapple with that, dig into the data, understand how the barriers to justice are playing out in your communities, and work with the justice system, with the courts, with prosecutors, with other bars, and with other agencies, social service providers, the private sector, to begin to address those barriers and ensure that the justice system delivers for people. And then the near-term challenge I would put to folks is really to raise awareness of these issues and to use your voice in this critical period in the coming months. WJP's toolkit, communications toolkit, distills all of this data into some infographics and slides that you can use in your presentations, as Robin did today, and there's lots more there to make the case and illustrate the challenge to diverse constituents, your members, the broader community, and then encourage folks to take action and use your voice to articulate the norms that we're expecting people to stand up for. Lauren will talk about the LDAD's democracy commitment, and I've signed it myself. I encourage everybody to do so. The Society for the Rule of Law has recently launched a statement of principles, again, from a cross-partisan perspective that I encourage people to take a look at. The law deans, just yesterday, over 100 of them issued a statement committing themselves to investing in rule of law education. The American College of Trial Lawyers earlier this month issued a statement defending our justice system. So there are lots of models out there and statements to join, and I encourage people to do so.
Yeah, thank you. And, with respect to the statements, make sure you have a policy in place. So bar associations, you should all make sure you have a policy in place for when you're going to issue statements and the scope of it, so that when you want to do something, you already have a process in place. And bars have been doing this for a long time, so it's good to take a look at the various processes that bars have. The other thing, with respect to what you said, Betsy, about the affordable and accessibility of our justice system, these are natural things that bars have historically been involved in, and it gives you the opportunity to create great partnerships. But also with emerging technology, specifically AI, this is the other opportunity to see how can we leverage AI to enhance the accessibility and success of our justice system. So just keep that in mind. You can marry technology and rule of law issues as part of your initiatives. Lauren?
Well, there's so much here to pull from. Let me just say a word about the democracy commitment, which Betsy so kindly referenced. That is something that we created as really a blueprint for lawyers to take a pledge and to agree to commit themselves to, again, as we've all been talking about, to use their special skills and talents to be able to protect the rule of law, the fundamental right to vote, and get involved in ensuring that our public officials act with integrity and promote civil discourse within our communities. So I do invite people to take a look at that, as it does, provide some very specific action items. I want to just add, though, to what, in addition to what we're talking about, because I think that as bar leaders, one of the most critical things that we could do is to think in terms of, and maybe even as part of a rule of law task force, as Betsy suggested, creating rapid response units where bar leaders are ready to protect the courts, protect judges, protect the jury system when they are under attack, protect election workers who are being threatened. We have to be able to respond to things that are dangerous. That's a low threshold, but it really ought to be something that every single bar association in the country should be thinking about and have on their radar screen, which is, how do I protect our system from the very real outright threats that they are getting against their lives, against their homes, against their families, simply for being part of the justice system, simply for being part of the election system. So that's a very specific area where I think bars have a very extraordinarily important role to play, and trying to think about how do we take this temperature down with respect to civil discourse and the way in which we talk to each other, and what should not be, the norms and principles of what should and shouldn't be acceptable. So I think those are pretty critical. I should just also add in pointing out about the law the law dean statement, that is a very specific action item that came out of the American Bar Association Task Force on American Democracy, to galvanize law school deans to make a statement about the importance of teaching democracy and bringing it into law schools.
Yeah, and in terms of, lowering the temperature and so forth, I mean, we are all models of the justice system. We walk and talk and interact with people all the time, and we can model that civility and lower that temperature and model the rationality and reasonableness of the rule of law. So we have that opportunity every day. And then with respect to some of the things you mentioned, Lauren, I'll just say with the rapid response teams, again, you can get those teams in place in your bar in advance of the election that's coming this year. So if there are things that happen, in your communities where members have questions, your website can be a source, a trusted neutral source of information. So again, start planning about how you might want to respond and protect attacks on the judiciary. It's not just the typical thing that we've seen historically, where judges or opinions might be attacked because people don't like the result. Now it's getting to the core of the legitimacy of our system. And that, again, is just something that's a core function of a lawyer, which is to demystify the process for people so that they can understand and have more enhanced trust of the process. Carl, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I was going to pick up a little bit where Lauren left off and simply make this point. I think it's critically important that we use our convening power to do the kind of thing she described with the dean's letter. That is to say, in communities, bar associations are in a position to convene business leaders, faith leaders, advocacy group leaders, citizen leaders, elected officials. And if they were all saying with one voice some of what we are saying to each other, our communities might be a little less tense and more peaceful. And there are opportunities. I mean, there are lots of models, back in the day, I guess, when I was a local bar president, and diversity, equity, and inclusion was front and center. We got managing partners of law firms to issue statements. After George Floyd was murdered, the same thing was true. Lots of people issued statements. Getting people to issue statements collectively about the importance of trust in the election system, trust in the rule of law is important, in part because social media is undermining the things we say are not heard sometimes by people who are looking at their phones and watching their tablets or whatever. And the sources of information in social media aren't simply from inside this country. The angertainment industry that wants to undermine the rule of law here is in part and perhaps in majority sourced from outside the shores of this country. And so we've got to not simply make statements, we've got to try to figure out ways to leverage the power that bar associations have by coming alongside, collaborating with others to expand our message and make sure that we're reaching much more broadly than we are when we're speaking to our members.
Is it okay, Robin, to just add one quick thing?
Of course.
When I was president of the Boston Bar Association, this is to Carl's point, one of the things that the Supreme Judicial Court did in our state was to convene bar leaders and media outlets, all ranges of media outlets on a regular basis to talk about dealing with attacks on the courts and how to report on the courts more accurately. And that's a model that actually bars could implement right now when we are, drowning in a sea of disinformation and misinformation. How do we work together with the media to provide accurate, factual, fair coverage of events that affect our justice system and democracy?
Yeah, that's perfect. And we have a question from the audience. Where courts want to work with bar leaders, how do you suggest we reach out to the public about voting rights and the justice system and doing this in a safe and respectful way? Betsy?
Well, I was going to ask you to answer that question because I know in Minnesota, the Minnesota State Bar has been working with the Secretary of State's office to generate resources and information from, a neutral, authoritative source that I think is a great model. Maybe you want to describe that.
So the model comes out of actually what the National Conference of Bar Presidents did about 2 years ago. We did a program with the Louisiana Secretary of State and Louisiana elected officials. And the recommendation was that bars partner with their Secretary of State's offices and start to get poll workers trained who are lawyers who could then go out and talk about how votes are counted, the integrity of the process. And so we did that in Minnesota. So even next week, our Secretary of State is speaking at our convention. And then we're doing a training with the Secretary of State's office in early July. And what's going to come out of that is we want our bar leaders to go out, our lawyers to go out in their communities and explain how the election process works. This is something that is easily replicable for state, local affinity bars. I highly recommend you do it. And Secretary of State's offices really want to partner with you, and they're used to doing this. So it's not a heavy workload for them to include bars. Let me turn to another question that we've got. Constitution Day is a good time to present a program on the rule of law. And so I want to ask our panelists, what are some of the options for programming about presenting on the rule of law on Constitution Day, Law Day, any day, even in advance of the election? What are some really, easily put togetherable programs that bars can do? Let me start with Lauren.
So I would vote for every day. If that's an option. I think that there is no end to the creativity you can actually employ in answering that question, Robin, because there are just so many opportunities. I remember a bar president once said to me, every day I wake up in the morning and I look at the newspaper and think about how I can use my position to make a difference in the world around what I'm reading. And I think that as bar leaders, we can all use that same kind of psychic energy right now to look at the paper and say, what is here that demands my attention as a lawyer and as a bar leader, and who can I work with to try to put something in place, whether it's an official bar program or a Rotary Club program or a League of Women Voters, but whatever it is, to try to tackle that issue and begin this long, difficult process of improving our civil discourse and educating people around why all this matters.
Can I add in 30 seconds, Robin? The Division for Public Education has all kinds of programs that bars do. The Division for what is, I think now Bar Leadership, used to be Bar Services, is a clearinghouse for programs that bar associations do related to Law Day and things like that. Obviously, the task force and commission's website will have resources and templates as well that you can use. And I'm probably forgetting some other NCBP has been programming things that you can model, copy, and present in your community as well.
Yeah, and what I want to do, I know we just have a couple minutes, just a couple of things I want to tell our attendees. One is take a look at the resources that have been linked in the chat, but also will be available on our website and will be emailed to our members, meaning you're going to get resources from Carl Smallwood about what's going on at Ohio State and the Divided Communities Project. You can leverage those resources. You can go to the LDAD website, okay? Everything that Lauren's been talking about today, you can get even more information from her website. World Justice Project, just as a clearinghouse for data and information about and toolkits for bars. So all of those are resources. The ABA Task Force, as well as the Supporting Advisory Commission. The website there has lots of resources. All four of us here are people who are willing to field emails and questions and get you to the resources that you need to get into action. So please don't be shy. Please reach out. We want to help you succeed. And so with that, I want to just thank everybody for being part of this panel. You've got an all-star panel here before you: Carl Smallwood, Betsy Andersen and Lauren Rikleen, who are constantly in action to promote the rule of law and democracy. I want to thank all of you for being here. I am now tasked with reading this slide in front of you, okay? And what I want you to do, attendees, is first, please complete our evaluation so that we can get information from you, because that helps us make even better programming in the future. So please give us your input and feedback on this program. Don't forget to renew or join as an NCBP member, and you can go to the National Conference of Bar Presidents website to do that. Don't forget, we've got our 2024 annual meeting in Chicago. The ABA will be there. The National Conference of Bar Presidents will be there. And I know that World Justice Project and Lawyers Defending American Democracy will also be at those meetings. So please don't forget to come to Chicago. And with that, what I want to do is thank you all for being here. Thank you to the panelists, and good luck in getting into action for promoting the rule of law. Thanks so much.